And yes, you're quite right. We are still doing the book of Isaiah today because this thing is massive and there's lots of really good stuff in it. I think I'm really kind of sad when Isaiah's over because it's so good. And I'm not stringing this out or anything. It's just to keep reading little bits and you don't have to read very far before you fill up a page of notes and do a video about it. So we're doing chapters 50 to 54. Did I say that already? Don't know. And this opens with Isaiah relaying to the Israelites that they're being punished basically because they're punks. Slight problem in that I don't know if they're being punished now, because this is during the King's era where it's probably not obvious they're being punished, but there were periods of things not going so well. Or is he talking about the future, because he keeps doing that? He's got a proper Quentin Tarantino thing going on. And of course this is nothing new in what we're reading here, but it's nice when you have a theme that runs throughout consistently. There is also a slightly odd part, odd's probably too strong a word, but you get it's quite a sort of big defence from Isaiah, almost like he's being attacked and he's arguing for what he's doing. It's, I've done my bit, I'm doing all this and that and the other, and whatever God asked me, I'm doing it. And it's almost like he is being attacked, but it's not obvious that that's the case, albeit he does actually say that he is taking a pretty hard time for this. I mean, this guy spent 3 years having to go around prophesying naked, didn't he? So, yeah, clearly that idea that to be called by God to be a prophet is, if he asks you, I mean, you can't say no, obviously, but oh dear, it's perhaps a mixed blessing and curse or something to some extent. Verse 21 is a really complicated wordy bit I had to read several times, but when you distill it down, I think what it's saying is that if you're a good person who's had things done to you, wronged you in life, the people who did that are going to have your sort of suffering lifted off you and put onto them. And you think, okay, well, that's nice sort of justice. But it's a sort of a hell idea, isn't it? And it's not clear if that's in... I assume it's not in life, just because that's not really how it works, is it? Arguably. So it seems almost like we're nudging around the edges of some sort of hell idea, which of course gets really interesting, whether hell is actually a forever torment thing, which just seems a bit ridiculous, or a total annihilation thing, which would seem to make more sense. Yes, that's difficult, but that whole concept of justice is, well, it's difficult anyway, and then Isaiah makes it more difficult by just talking about things all over the shop. And he keeps messing up his tenses. 1 minute he's talking about Abraham in the past tense, makes perfect sense, but the next he's talking about what sounds like Jesus in the past tense, despite the fact it's 500 years away or whatever it is from this point, a long, long way. And he never names Jesus or anything. It's just... he just, no matter what he's talking about, he seems to talk in the past tense, and so and he talk about things that are covering thousands of years, so it's quite tricky. Chapter 52 verse 7, I'm just recording this just for vague interest. It's a phrase I'd heard before. I wouldn't have guessed it was from the Old Testament, but it's how beautiful on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news. That's don't know, it's just vaguely interesting. We have another prediction that sounds like Jesus, specifically talking about him being disfigured. And that's sort of interesting, because, I mean, we know he was supposedly beaten up and all the rest of it. So you could understand that maybe he ended up somewhat disfigured. But it occurred that this ties up with the Shroud of Turin as well, because from that, the imprint of the man that no one can explain is really freaking weird. You can tell from that, I gather, that he had a broken nose, so obviously being smashed about a bit. Potentially that could argue against, there's another prediction somewhere else, I can't remember if I've read it already or if I just heard it somewhere else, but the idea that none of his bones were going to be broken. But of course your nose isn't a bone, so if you have your nose broken you'd be disfigured, but you still wouldn't have had any bones broken. So it's remarkable how that all sort of ties up. And I have to say, in general, for Christianity, you've got to hand it to them. You look at Isaiah and you can make all sorts of arguments that doesn't fit, but you cannot argue with the fact that this stuff was written before Jesus, and the historical accounts of Jesus, the bits that aren't disputed, do line up remarkably well with it. So it's, you can't necessarily get a conclusion from it, but it looks pretty good. Chapter 53 verse 4 I thought I would read, just because I quite like doing a little bit of that in there. So we're going to need the keep of the book. And it says, Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. It unfortunately doesn't say how by our wounds, no, how by his wounds we are healed, which I guess in the context now we've got the rest of Christianity go, oh yes, he died, we're healed by that. Great. But this is hundreds of years before all of that. So people at the time must be scratching their heads going, what on earth is he talking about? A thought that occurs here, along that same line, that everything seems to line up very well from Isaiah to the life of Jesus, or the death of Jesus, I suppose. But could there be a scenario where Jesus comes along, he's a little Jewish boy, grows up reading all the Torah and all the rest of it, and it turns out he's really smart and a bit of a nutter. So the smart bit comes in where he works out some sort of scenario where if I did all this, it would fulfill these prophecies made in Isaiah, and that would be kind of cool. Trouble is, of course, he'd have to be an utter nutter, because at the same time, he obviously inevitably it gets him killed. So there's not really much incentive to do that. And then the next step to that would be, of course, that his disciples are so blown away by the fact that this guy comes along and seems to fulfill all this stuff, apart from the coming back to life. But then the coming back to life part isn't predicted, it's not so far as I can tell. So could they have made up a story that he came back to life to sort of honour him, as it were, because he did such a good job of fitting that? And then they go and spread that all around everywhere to start Christianity, basically. And they do that despite being persecuted and getting killed for it. And obviously the answer to that was that was a stupid theory. But at the same time, because the predictions are so good for what did happen, basically I'm just trying to work out, how does it fit so well? I mean, you're surely not going to engineer it, because that would just be stupid. Disciples and apostles aren't going to make that stuff up and get themselves killed when they know it's not true, because he got killed and he stayed dead. So you wouldn't make up a resurrection, which maybe, but it's a lot of people, so not very likely. But I'm struggling for what other explanation could you come up with for how well Isaiah fits the arrival of Jesus. And it's really difficult, because I don't like the idea of a prophecy. But at the same time, we know we've got a whole copy of Isaiah written hundreds of years before Jesus. So we know for a fact this wasn't made up afterwards to fit what happened. And it's, I don't know. It's not something I feel like a prophecy from thousands of years ago is not something that we should be persuaded by. But at the end of the day, if you actually look at it all and line it all up, it's just like, well, how else does that fit? I just don't know. If anyone has any great ideas for how that could otherwise fit together in some other way, I'd be very interested to hear it. Chapter 54, verse 6, likens God to a wife married young, only to get rejected. And this is really interesting, because you get that idea, it's the Marcion idea, I believe that's the idea, that the God of the Old Testament and New Testament are so different. So the argument is that they're two different gods. It's just doesn't pan out how Christianity would want to say it. But my feeling when I was reading the book of Judges, as I've said before, is that you can read it as God's just been horrible to them, but they've been absolute punks consistently, doing terrible things, following dodgy people and sacrificing children, and just awful. And yet he keeps trying to come back and give them another chance to save them. And I think that's just a much better way to characterise the Old Testament. Instead of it being God was angry and wrathful and all the rest of it and punishing people, think of it in terms of that. And God does actually say, in a surge of anger he hid his face, obviously metaphorical face, but ultimately has compassion. And you go, yeah, that's kind of fair, isn't it? And this is a guy who's just in a room full of absolutely terrible people trying to say, here, just do this simple thing and you can get all this good stuff. And they don't do it. And then they do terrible things as well. It's the sort of thing where today you can see if all that stuff was happening and people were routinely sacrificing their children in fires to Baal and all the rest of it, you can see people saying, well, that's proof God doesn't exist, because he wouldn't allow that to happen. He'd be a terrible God. And then in the Old Testament, where he's actually getting those people dealt with, people look at it and go, oh, he's a terrible person. There's no way that's going to be real. Or if God exists, he's a terrible person. And I suppose in that, the objection that God is doing things people don't like, it's not an objection against the existence of God anyway. So it's you sort of have to presuppose the existence of God to be disapproving of what he does or doesn't do. But yeah, I haven't finished the Old Testament yet, but it does feel massively misunderstood in terms of, you just ask Joe Bloggs on the street, what do you think of the Old Testament? And it's a very different thing than I'm finding. Even more interesting is that God then goes on to say that, so now I have sworn not to be angry with you or rebuke you again. The trouble is, as well, of course, this is Isaiah, so I don't think we're talking now, because this is pre-Babylonian exile, so actually they're going to be rebuked by virtue of the Babylonians coming along and kicking them out. So, on the assumption that he's talking about once Jesus has arrived, we've got another one of these one-sided covenants. So notice there, it's not saying, if you do this, then I will never rebuke you again. It's just saying, I will never rebuke you again. So with Noah, it was the case of, I'll never destroy humanity with a flood again. The convenient caveat that it could be fire or an asteroid or zombies. But the point is, there's no condition attached. It's just, that's done. I'm not going to do that again. And it occurred that in that is potentially the reason for the difference between the Old Testament and New Testament God. As in, it's the same person, he's just taken a different attitude. As he does, he has clearly evolved along the way with all this. So Jesus comes along and then sets a new covenant, as it were. So God is no longer doing fire and brimstone, Old Testament sort of things, because by Jesus' wounds we are healed. And yeah, that seems like a perfect answer for the Marcion problem of two different gods. It's like, no, he's just said at this point he's going to move on to the next bit of societal development, and there's going to be a new deal, and in that new deal he's no longer going to be doing all that stuff, and then we're going to have to live to a different standard, which I've talked about before. It's arguably the standard post Jesus, where you haven't got 613 rules. You've got your basically a principle, follow Jesus, which is arguably harder, I think. So yeah, it just sort of shows progression. You can see the transition arriving, or being hinted at, from the difference between the Old Testament to the New Testament, I think. Something like that, anyway. And last but not least, he mentions, if anyone dares attack you, or everyone does attack you, because I can't read my own writing, they will surrender to you. And again, that's not clear. Is that afterlife thing, or is that it's clearly not in life? Because if someone attacks you now, then you get beat up, and it's not very nice. So in the afterlife, potentially again. So huge ideas anyway. It's just amazing, this thing, in terms of all the stuff in it. And the problem is, of course, it's really difficult to untangle, but if you sort of zoom out and look at the themes throughout rather than any individual bit, which is really hard, the themes definitely point in a certain direction, which do seem to show that there's going to transition away from Old Testamentness towards New Testamentness, albeit at the point here no one's aware of the New Testament yet. But yeah, we've got a couple more videos to do on Isaiah, I think. So yeah, some big stuff still. I've read ahead a little bit, so there's still some more big stuff to come. But we'll carry on and see if these big concepts emerge a little further.